Texas, 1875. The scorching summer heat shimmered across the empty railroad platform at Wishbone Station. Eleanor Blackwood stood alone, her leather trunk and carpet bag her only companions, as the train that brought her disappeared over the horizon. She checked her silver pocket watch for the 5th time, squinting at the sun that had moved a considerable distance across the sky since her arrival. The man who had promised to make her his wife was nowhere to be seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The station master had left hours ago, locking the tiny depot office with a sympathetic glance. "Miss, ain't nobody coming from Copper Creek today? Roads washed out from the storm 3 days back." But Eleanor had nowhere to go. 3,000 miles from Boston, with barely enough money for a meal, she was stranded in a desolate outpost between civilization and wilderness. As dusk approached, bringing no relief from the heat, a lone rider appeared on the distant ridge. Not her intended husband, but a Comanche scout working for the U.S. Cavalry. Their unexpected meeting would forever alter the course of both their lives, challenging the rigid boundaries of two vastly different worlds. June in Texas was nothing like June in Boston. Eleanor Blackwood dabbed at her forehead with a handkerchief that had long since lost its crisp whiteness, now limp and damp from hours of absorbing perspiration. Her high-necked traveling dress, practical and modest for the journey west, now felt like a portable oven in the relentless heat. When she'd boarded the train in Boston 23 days ago, her mother's tears still damp on her cheek, Eleanor had imagined this moment differently. There would be a gentleman waiting, perhaps not handsome like the heroes in the novels she'd secretly read, but respectable. Gordon Wells, the cattle rancher from Copper Creek, had described himself as a man of means with a fine house in need of a proper lady's touch. His letters, though infrequent and businesslike, had promised security and perhaps, in time, affection. The advertisement in the Boston Herald had caught her eye 6 months earlier. Rancher seeks educated woman of good character and sturdy. Constitution as wife. Position offers comfort, respect, and partnership in growing enterprise. At 26, with her parents' modest savings dwindling and no suitors on the horizon, Eleanor had made her choice with rational deliberation. Her correspondence with Gordon had been equally pragmatic, an exchange of qualifications and expectations rather than romantic declarations. Yet standing alone at Wishbone Station, a grandiose name for what amounted to a wooden platform, a small depot building, and a water tower, all her practical considerations seemed foolish. The station master, a weathered man named Perkins, had departed hours ago, after repeatedly checking the telegraph line that had been silent since the storm. "Storm took out the bridge at Rattlesnake Creek," he'd explained. "Likely why you're mister. Ain't here. No way to cross for 30 miles in either direction. Telegraph line to Copper Creek's down too." He'd hesitated before adding, "There's a boarding house in Meridian, 15 miles back the way you came. Train won't return until Thursday." But Thursday was 4 days away, and the few dollars sewn into the hem of her petticoat were meant for emergencies far worse than this. So Eleanor had thanked him, assured him she would manage, and watched him ride away on a mule that seemed as ancient and sun-baked as its owner. As the sun began its descent, Eleanor moved her trunk into the narrow strip of shade beside the depot building. The structure was locked tight, offering no refuge. She opened her bag and retrieved a small canteen, allowing herself a meager sip of warm water. Next came a wrapped packet containing 2 biscuits and a piece of jerky, the last of her traveling provisions. She had just finished this sparse meal when she spotted movement on the ridge to the west. A solitary rider silhouetted against the reddening sky. Relief surged through her, followed by wariness. Was it Gordon finally arrived, or someone else entirely? As the rider approached, Eleanor could see it was not her intended husband, unless Gordon had dramatically misrepresented himself in his letters. This man rode with a fluid grace that suggested he and his horse were one entity. He wore no hat despite the sun, and his black hair was long, secured at the nape of his neck. His skin was copper in the evening light, his features sharp and watchful. Eleanor stood straighter, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. She was alone in the wilderness with a stranger, and everything she had been taught warned her of the danger. Yet something in the man's careful approach, the way he kept his hands visible, reassured her that he meant no harm. He stopped his horse at a respectful distance, studying her with eyes that missed nothing. "Ma'am," he said finally, his English clear but accented, "you shouldn't be here alone. Night comes, and with it, coyotes and worse." "I'm waiting for Mr. Gordon Wells," Eleanor replied, striving for dignity despite her disheveled state. "From Copper Creek Ranch. Perhaps you know him." A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, crossed the man's face. "I know of Wells. His ranch is 3 days' ride north. The bridge is gone." "So I've been told," Eleanor said, unable to keep disappointment from her voice. "I'm to be his wife. He was to meet me today, but—" She gestured helplessly at the empty station. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, and Eleanor saw that though he wore the clothes of a frontiersman, buckskin pants, a faded blue cotton shirt, worn leather boots, he also carried a Springfield rifle and wore what appeared to be a cavalry scout's badge on his belt. "I am Thomas Hawking," he said. "Scout for Fort Davidson. The Army pays me to know this territory." He glanced at her trunk, her small bag. "You cannot stay here. 3 cougars have been seen near the water tower this week. They smell the horses that pass." Eleanor felt a chill despite the heat. "I have nowhere else to go until the train returns on Thursday." Thomas Hawking's face remained impassive, but his eyes held an unexpected kindness. "There is a settlement, 2 hours' ride, small but safe. My sister lives there with her husband, a former Army doctor." "You would take me there?" Eleanor asked, hope and apprehension mingling in her chest. "It is not proper for an unmarried white woman to travel alone with a Comanche man," he said matter-of-factly. "But it is less proper for you to be eaten by cougars." Despite everything, Eleanor found herself smiling at his blunt assessment. "When you put it that way, Mr. Hawking, I believe I'll risk the impropriety." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Your trunk," he said, eyeing the heavy leather case. "Too big for my horse, with 2 riders. It must stay." Eleanor's heart sank. Everything she owned was in that trunk. Her clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, the family, Bible, the few books she couldn't bear to leave behind. "Could we not come back for it tomorrow?" Thomas considered this. "Perhaps, if no one takes it, if the rains don't come again tonight." He looked west, where dark clouds were gathering. "We should go now, before light fails." Making a swift decision, Eleanor opened the trunk and removed a small oilskin packet containing her important papers, a change of undergarments, and a photograph of her parents. These she added to her carpet bag. After a moment's hesitation, she also took her father's old pistol, wrapped in a shawl. Gordon had written that life in Texas could be dangerous, and her father had insisted she bring protection. "I'm ready," she said, closing the trunk and saying a silent prayer that it would remain undisturbed. Thomas Hawking helped her mount his horse, a sturdy paint with alert eyes and a white blaze. Eleanor sat sideways, awkward in her long skirts, and Thomas swung up behind her, maintaining a careful distance that propriety would barely allow. He took the reins, his arms on either side of her but not touching, and clicked his tongue to set the horse in motion. They rode in silence for a time, Eleanor acutely aware of the stranger at her back, his presence both reassuring and unnerving. The landscape changed as they left the station behind. scrubby plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with live oaks and the occasional cluster of prickly pear cactus. A jackrabbit darted across their path, startling Eleanor, and Thomas steadied her with the lightest touch on her arm before withdrawing his hand as if burned. "Have you been in Texas long, Mr. Hawking?" she asked, desperate to break the awkward silence. "All my life," he replied. "My people hunted these lands before the first white man came." "Yet you scout for the army?" She couldn't keep the question from her voice. "Times change," he said simply. "We change or we die." They crested a hill, and Thomas pointed to a stand of cottonwoods in the distance. "Willow Creek. The settlement is there. 20 families. Some Apache, some Mexican, some white. They tolerate each other because they must. And your sister? She lives there happily?" Eleanor wasn't sure why she asked, except that the thought of any woman finding contentment in this harsh land gave her hope. Sarah was captured as a child during a raid, raised Comanche, then the army came, took her back to the white world. She trained as a nurse at the mission school, married the doctor. His voice was neutral, but Eleanor sensed deeper currents. "She walks in both worlds now, not easily, but she walks." The clouds were moving faster now, building into towering anvils over the western hills. A cool wind picked up, bringing the scent of rain and sage. Thomas urged the horse to a faster pace. "Will Mr. Wells come looking for me, do you think?" Eleanor asked. Thomas was silent for a long moment. "Wells has a temper," he finally said, "and he does not like to be inconvenienced. It would be best if you stayed at Willow Creek until the bridge is repaired. My sister can send word once the telegraph is working again." Something in his careful phrasing made Eleanor uneasy. "You know something about Mr. Wells that I should know, don't you?" Thomas's silence was enough. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Please," she said, half turning to look at him. "I've come 3,000 miles to marry a man I've never met. If there's something I should know." Lightning fractured the sky in the distance, followed seconds later by a rumble of thunder. The horse snorted nervously. "Gordon Wells has had 2 wives before you," Thomas said finally. "The first died of fever. The second, there are stories. Nothing proven." Eleanor felt cold despite the humid air. "What kind of stories?" "They say she tried to leave him. That her horse came back without her. Wells said she ran off with a cattle buyer, but no one ever saw her again." Thomas spoke with careful precision. "They also say he drinks. When he drinks, he fights, that his ranch hands don't stay long." The implications were clear enough. Eleanor stared at her hands gripping the pommel of the saddle. "Why would you? And tell me this, you don't know me. I'm nothing to you." "You asked," Thomas said simply, "and my sister would be angry if I knew and said nothing." The first fat raindrops began to fall as the settlement came into view, a cluster of simple buildings, nestled among the cottonwoods. Smoke rose from stone chimneys, and a few oil lamps glowed in windows against the gathering dusk. It was neither as primitive as Eleanor had feared, nor as substantial as she had hoped. A place of survival rather than prosperity. Thomas guided the horse to a small cabin set apart from the others, its yard neat and bounded by a low stone wall. Before they reached it, the door opened, and a woman stepped onto the porch, hand shading her eyes as she peered through the increasing rain. Sarah. Hawking Reynolds bore little resemblance to her brother at first glance. Her skin was fair, her hair a rich brown tied back in a practical braid. Yet as they drew closer, Eleanor saw the same watchful intelligence in her eyes, the same economy of movement. "Thomas!" she called. "You're just in time. Robert says this storm will be worse than the last." Her gaze fell on Eleanor, surprise and then understanding dawning in her expression. "And you've brought company." Thomas dismounted and helped Eleanor down, her legs stiff and unsteady after the long ride. "This is Miss Eleanor Blackwood," he explained, "from Boston to marry Gordon Wells. Found her alone at Wishbone Station." Sarah's eyebrows rose, but she quickly masked her reaction and hurried down the steps. "Miss Blackwood, please come in out of this weather. You must be exhausted." She shot her brother a look that suggested they would speak more of this later, then took Eleanor's arm with gentle firmness. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, shelves lined with books and medical supplies. A curtain separated what Eleanor presumed was a bedroom. Everything was scrupulously clean, with touches of beauty in unexpected places. Wildflowers in a blue jar, a colourful woven blanket on a rocking chair, a small painting of mountains in a gilt frame. "Robert is at the Miller place," Sarah explained, helping Eleanor remove her damp outer garments. "Their youngest has the croup, but he'll return once the rain lets up. Please, sit by the fire." Thomas remained by the door as if uncertain of his welcome. "You too, brother," Sarah said, her voice softening. "You're soaked through." She busied herself at the stove, where a pot of something fragrant simmered. "Miss Blackwood, we have stew. And cornbread, not what you're used to, perhaps, but hot and filling." "It smells wonderful," Eleanor said sincerely. "And please, call me Eleanor. After all, your brother may have saved my life today." "Thomas has a habit of finding strays," Sarah said with a small smile, "though usually they have 4 legs, not 2. Eleanor wasn't sure whether to be amused or offended by the comparison, but Thomas's quiet chuckle decided her. "I suppose I am rather a stray at the moment," she admitted, "and very grateful for your kindness." Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows and thunder shaking the small cabin. Eleanor felt a profound sense of displacement, as if she had stepped into someone else's life. 24 hours ago, she had still been on the train, watching the landscape transform from the familiar eastern woodlands to these alien plains, filled with both trepidation and determination about her new life with Gordon Wells. Now, sitting in a stranger's cabin at the edge of nowhere, that carefully planned future seemed to evaporate like morning mist. What was she to do if the rumors about Wells were true? Return to Boston in humiliating defeat? Try to make a life here in this harsh country so unlike everything she knew? "You're thinking too hard," Sarah said quietly, setting a bowl of stew before her. "Eat first, worry after." It was good advice. Eleanor ate, surprised by her own hunger, while Sarah and Thomas conversed quietly in a language she didn't understand. Comanche, she presumed. Their voices rose and fell like the wind. Outside, occasionally punctuated by glances in her direction. "It's rude to talk about your guest in a language she doesn't speak," Eleanor finally said, surprising herself with her boldness. Sarah looked startled, then laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "You're right. Forgive us. It's an old habit. Thomas was telling me about the situation at Wishbone Station, and I was telling him he should have brought your trunk, regardless of the inconvenience." "The trunk can wait," Eleanor said. "But I do need to get word to Mr. Wells somehow. He'll be concerned." The siblings exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. "The telegraph will be repaired once the storm passes," Sarah said carefully. "But Eleanor, perhaps you should consider whether this marriage is truly what you want. Gordon Wells has a reputation." "So your brother informed me. But I've traveled a very long way based on an agreement with Mr. Wells. I can't simply abandon it without even meeting the man." "No," Sarah acknowledged, "but you can proceed with caution. Stay here for a few days. Robert and I would welcome the company. When the bridge is repaired, Thomas can take you to Copper Creek in daylight with my husband as chaperone." It was a sensible suggestion, and Eleanor was tempted to agree immediately, but something made her hesitate. "Won't Mr. Wells be angry if I don't come directly? If he thinks I've been improper?" Thomas, who had been silent during this exchange, spoke abruptly. "Wells lost the right to judge others' propriety long ago." "Thomas," Sarah warned, but he continued, "she should know what kind of man she's agreeing to marry. Not just rumors, but facts." He turned to Eleanor, his gaze direct. "Wells treats his ranch hands like slaves. Cheats the Apache who work his cattle. Last year he shot a Comanche boy he caught fishing in his creek. Said the boy was stealing. The boy was 10 years old. Eleanor felt sick. How do you know this? Because I tracked Wells for the army when the boy's father came looking for revenge. Kept them from killing each other. Not for their sakes, but because the army would have used it as an excuse to attack our camp." The cabin fell silent, except for the storm's rage outside. Eleanor stared into her empty bowl, trying to reconcile the man in Thomas's account with the formal, businesslike letters she had received. "People can change," she said finally, without much conviction. "Yes," Sarah agreed, her voice gentle, "but seldom without reason or consequence." She reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. "All we're suggesting is that you take time to learn more before you commit your life to this man." Eleanor looked at their joined hands, Sarah's strong and tanned, her own pale and already showing the effects of her journey west. How naive she must seem to these people who lived daily with hardship and danger. Yet they hadn't dismissed her, or mocked her, but offered help with no expectation of return. "Thank you," she said simply. "I will consider it." Later, after Sarah had made up a pallet for her near the fire and retired behind the curtained bedroom, Eleanor lay awake listening to the storm. Thomas had left to sleep in the small stable behind the cabin, despite the weather and his sister's protests. "It would not be proper," he had said, with a glance at Eleanor that held something like respect. Proper. The word seemed to have lost all meaning. What was proper about her situation? A mail-order bride, abandoned at a remote station, rescued by a Comanche scout, sheltering in a cabin with nearby strangers while her intended husband remained unaware of her whereabouts. Nothing in her Boston upbringing had prepared her for this, yet beneath her anxiety, Eleanor felt a surprising spark of something like excitement. For the first time in her carefully ordered life, she faced a future entirely unscripted. Whatever happened next would be of her own choosing, not dictated by financial necessity or social convention. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last thought was of Thomas Hawking's face when he spoke of protecting the Comanche boy's father from his own revenge. There had been pain there and anger, but also a fierce integrity that both impressed and unsettled her. In Boston, she had known exactly what kind of man made a suitable husband. Here, on this wild frontier, she was no longer certain. The storm continued through the night, transforming the world outside the cabin. By morning, when Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and baking biscuits, Willow Creek had become an island in a sea of mud, the creek itself risen well beyond its banks, cutting them off from both Wishbone Station and the road to Copper Creek. For better or worse, she was stranded, caught between the life she had left behind and the life she had planned to begin. And as she rose to face the new day, Eleanor Blackwood realized that perhaps this unexpected interlude was exactly what she needed. Morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows, casting golden patterns across the rough-hewn floor. Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar sounds of a settlement coming to life. Chickens clucking, a distant cow lowing, voices calling greetings in a mixture of English, Spanish, and languages she couldn't identify. Sarah was already dressed and busy at the cookstove when Eleanor rose from her pallet. "Good morning," the woman said with a warm smile. "I hope you slept well despite the storm." "Better than I expected," Eleanor admitted, smoothing her rumpled dress self-consciously. "Though I'm afraid I'm not very presentable." "We're less concerned with appearances here than in Boston, I imagine," Sarah replied, handing her a steaming cup of coffee. "But I've laid out a dress that might fit you, behind the screen there. It's plain, but clean." The dress was indeed simple, a calico in faded blue, with practical buttons down the front. But the fabric was soft with washing, and it fit reasonably well, if a bit loose at the waist and short at the ankles. Eleanor emerged feeling somewhat restored, her hair re-braided and pinned as neatly as possible, without her usual toiletries. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I feel human again." "You look it," came a deep voice from the doorway. A tall man with sandy hair and a weathered face stood there, medical bag in hand. "Robert Reynolds," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "At your service, Miss Blackwood." "My husband," Sarah explained unnecessarily, her expression softening as she looked at him. "How is the Miller child, Robert?" Breathing easier, the steam tent did its work. He crossed to the wash basin, scrubbing his hands vigorously. "Thomas filled me in on our guest situation when I passed the stable. Quite a predicament, Miss Blackwood." Eleanor lifted her chin slightly. "A temporary one, I'm sure. Once the waters recede—" "That may be some time," Robert interrupted gently. "The creek has overflowed its banks for half a mile in each direction. The bridge to Copper Creek is completely washed out, and there are reports of flooding all the way to the Brazos River." "Oh!" Eleanor sank onto a chair, her momentary confidence evaporating. "Then I truly am stranded." "Not stranded," Sarah corrected, placing a plate of eggs and biscuits before her. "Just delayed. And perhaps that's Providence at work." "Sarah," Robert warned, but his wife continued, "Eleanor deserves to know what she's walking into with Gordon Wells. You've treated his ranch hands after his disciplinary actions. You've seen the bruises on Meg Harper when she delivers eggs to the mercantile." "Meg Harper?" Eleanor asked, her appetite suddenly gone. "Wells's housekeeper," Robert explained reluctantly. "A widow who works for room and board for herself and her son. She's clumsy, according to Wells. Falls down the stairs with remarkable frequency." The implication was unmistakable. Eleanor pushed her plate away, stomach churning. "I don't understand. In his letters, Mr. Wells presented himself as a respectable businessman. The advertisement specified a man of means seeking a wife to help manage his household." She looked from Sarah to Robert. "Why would such a man send for a bride from Boston if he's what you're suggesting?" "Because local women won't have him," came Thomas's voice as he entered through the back door, stooping slightly under the low lintel. "And because a woman with money and connections from the East has value beyond being a wife. Wells has gambling debts. His ranch is mortgaged to the bank in Austin." "Thomas," Sarah chided, "good morning to you too." He nodded to his sister. Then, to Eleanor, "I checked the creek, still rising. No crossing for at least 4 days, maybe longer." Eleanor felt torn between relief at the delay and distress at her helplessness. "What am I to do?" she murmured, more to herself than the others. "First, eat your breakfast," Sarah said firmly. "Then we'll introduce you to Willow Creek. Life goes on, flood or no flood." After breakfast, true to her word, Sarah took Eleanor on a tour of the small settlement. Despite the muddy thoroughfare that passed for a main street, people were going about their business. A blacksmith hammering at his forge, women hanging laundry on lines strung between cottonwoods, children chasing chickens and each other with equal enthusiasm. Eleanor was struck by the diversity of the community. As Thomas had said, there were white families, Mexican families, and Native Americans, primarily Apache, Sarah explained, but also 2 Comanche families related to Thomas. "How did this place come to be?" Eleanor asked, as they picked their way carefully along a relatively dry path. "It seems unusual for for everyone to live so together? Sarah smiled. It began with the spring. Clean water is precious in these parts. The Apache knew this place long before anyone else. Then came a few Mexican families from the south, fleeing the unrest there. The army established a small outpost to monitor the frontier, which is where Robert was stationed as a surgeon. When the army moved the outpost farther west, some people stayed. Others came later, looking for a fresh start. And they all get along. Eleanor couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Not always, Sarah admitted. There are disagreements, prejudices, but out here, survival depends on cooperation. A lone family can't stand against drought, bandits, or illness. She paused at the edge of a small garden where an elderly woman was weeding among rows of corn and beans. "Grandmother Blue Feather, good morning." The woman looked up, her dark eyes sharp in a face mapped with wrinkles. She said something in a language Eleanor didn't understand. "She welcomes you," Sarah translated. "She says you have traveled far and carry many burdens." Eleanor blinked in surprise. How could she know that? Sarah smiled. "Grandmother sees more than most. She was a medicine woman of her tribe before the reservations. Now she tends the garden and shares her wisdom with anyone wise enough to listen." The old woman spoke again, her voice stronger than her frail appearance suggested. "She says you stand at a crossroads, that the path you choose will determine whether your heart withers or blooms in this land." Sarah's translation was matter-of-fact, but her eyes were watchful on Eleanor's face. "Please thank her for her concern," Eleanor said, unsettled by the prescience of the woman's words. As they continued their walk, they came to a small, whitewashed building with a cross mounted above the door. "Our school and church," Sarah explained. "Reverend Matthews comes through once a month for services, but Miss Abigail teaches daily, when the children aren't needed in the fields or at home." The door opened, and a young woman emerged, wiping chalk dust from her hands onto a practical, dark skirt. She was perhaps Eleanor's age, with spectacles perched on a nose liberally sprinkled with freckles. "Sarah, I heard we had a visitor." The woman approached with an outstretched hand and a warm smile. "Abigail Thornton. Welcome to our little outpost of civilization." "Eleanor Blackwood," she replied, finding herself returning the smile. "I understand you're the teacher here, and postmistress, and occasionally nurse when Dr. Reynolds needs an extra hand." Abigail's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "We all wear multiple hats here. Miss Thornton came from Philadelphia 3 years ago," Sarah explained. "She's made quite an impact on our community." "The children did that," Abigail demurred. "They're eager to learn, whether their parents are white, Apache, or Mexican. Knowledge is the great equalizer." She glanced at the sky, where clouds were gathering again. "You must join us for dinner at the boarding house tonight. Mrs. Perkins sets a good table, and you can meet more of our little community." The prospect of extending her social circle was both appealing and daunting to Eleanor. She was acutely aware of her status as an outsider, a woman who had left her home to marry a man she'd never met, a man the locals clearly despised. "Thank you," she said carefully, "if the weather permits." "Oh, we carry on rain or shine," Abigail assured her. "Life's too short to let a little water interfere with good company." She glanced over Eleanor's shoulder, and her expression brightened. "Thomas, I was hoping to see you today." Eleanor turned to find Thomas Hawking approaching, leading his paint horse. He nodded to Abigail with an ease that suggested familiarity, then addressed Sarah. "Robert asked me to tell you that he's gone to the Martinez place. Their oldest boy, who broke his arm falling from the hayloft. That would be Julio," Sarah sighed, "always climbing where he shouldn't. Thank you, Thomas. Will you join us at the boarding house tonight?" A shadow crossed his face. "I should return to the fort. I'm overdue for my report." "In this weather?" Sarah's skepticism was clear. The fort can wait another day. The creek crossing isn't safe. For a moment, Eleanor thought he would argue, but then he nodded. One more night, then. Eleanor realized with a start that his reluctance might be due to her presence. Perhaps he regretted bringing her to Willow Creek, disrupting his family's routine. The thought stung more than she expected. "Mr. Hawking," she said impulsively, "I want to thank you again for your assistance yesterday. I know it was an inconvenience." His dark eyes studied her, unreadable. It was the right thing to do. "Still, I'm grateful, and I hope my presence here won't cause any difficulties for you or your family." Something in his expression softened. Fractionally. "No difficulties, Miss Blackwood. Willow Creek welcomes those in need." "Even mail-order brides intended for Gordon Wells?" she asked, attempting a lightness she didn't feel. "Especially them," Abigail interjected with surprising firmness. "Any woman brave enough to travel across the country to make a new life deserves our respect." She glanced meaningfully at Thomas. "Don't you agree?" "Bravery takes many forms," he replied, his gaze still on Eleanor. "Some are more foolhardy than others." Before Eleanor could respond to this ambiguous assessment, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A man on horseback was approaching, a canter, his clothes soaked and mud-spattered. Thomas stepped forward, hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Easy," Sarah murmured. "It's just Daniel Parker from the Lazy Pea. Probably news about the flooding." The rider reined in sharply when he spotted their group. "Thomas, just the man I need. There's trouble." What kind of trouble? Thomas's voice had changed, taking on an edge of command that surprised Eleanor. "Wells and his men. They're headed this way, probably reach town by nightfall." Parker wiped rain from his face with a grimy sleeve. "They're looking for a woman. A mail-order bride who didn't show up. At Wishbone Station. Wells is in a foul mood, drinking heavily. He's got it in his head that someone from Willow Creek intercepted her." All eyes turned to Eleanor, who felt the blood drain from her face. "But how could he know? The bridge is washed out." "Wells found another crossing upriver," Parker explained. "Dangerous as hell with the water this high, but he made it. Lost 2 horses in the attempt." "Damn fool," Thomas muttered. "He'll get himself and his men killed." "That's not all." Parker leaned forward in his saddle, lowering his voice, though there was no one else nearby to hear. "He's accusing the Comanche of kidnapping her, telling everyone who'll listen that it's proof the savages can't be trusted, that the army should run them all to the reservations in Indian Territory." Thomas's expression hardened to granite. "He means to start a conflict, give the army an excuse to break the treaty." "It's absurd," Eleanor protested. "I wasn't kidnapped. You rescued me." But even as she spoke, she understood the danger. Who would believe her word against that of an established rancher? Especially when her rescuer was Comanche. "We need to get Eleanor away from here," Sarah said urgently. "If Wells finds her with us, it will only confirm his accusations." "But where would I go?" Eleanor asked, panic rising in her throat. "The creek is flooded in all directions." "The old mission," Abigail suggested. 2 miles east in the foothills. It's abandoned, but still has a sound roof. No one would think to look there." "I'll take her," Thomas decided. "We can be there before sunset, and I can double back to monitor Wells's movements." "I'll go too," Abigail offered. "A woman alone with a Comanche scout would be scandalous, but with a respectable schoolteacher as chaperone." She smiled grimly. "Well, it's still scandalous, but less so." Eleanor felt as if events were spiraling beyond her control. "Wait," she protested. "Shouldn't I simply meet with Mr. Wells, explain the situation? Surely once he sees I'm unharmed—" "You don't understand," Thomas cut her off. "This isn't about you. Wells has been looking for an excuse to drive the remaining Comanche from this territory. The accusation of kidnapping a white woman is perfect. Even if proved false later, the damage will be done." "He's right," Sarah said gently. "Wells has powerful friends in Austin. Men who want the treaty lands opened for ranching and railroad development. They've been waiting for an incident like this. Eleanor looked from face to face, seeing the gravity of the situation reflected in each expression. "I never intended to cause such trouble," she whispered. "No one is blaming you," Abigail assured her, "but we need to act quickly. I'll gather supplies while you collect your things from Sarah's cabin." An hour later, Eleanor found herself once again on Thomas's paint horse, this time with Abigail riding behind her. They followed a narrow trail through scrub brush and scattered oaks, climbing gradually into rocky foothills. The old mission came into view as the sun was beginning its descent, a simple stone structure with a bell tower, partially reclaimed by creeping vines, but still solid. "The Spanish built it 100 years ago," Abigail explained as they dismounted. "It was abandoned during the Mexican War of Independence. The local Apache considered it a place of bad medicine for many years, but that superstition has faded. It looks formidable," Eleanor observed, noting the thick walls and narrow windows. "It was designed to withstand attacks," Thomas said, leading his horse to a small lean-to beside the main building. The early missionaries weren't always welcome. Inside, the mission was surprisingly intact. A stone altar still stood at one end of the main room, and wooden benches lined the walls. Abigail busied herself laying out the supplies she had brought: blankets, lanterns, food that wouldn't spoil, and a small medical kit. "We may need to stay here for a few days," she explained, "until Wells gives up his search or the army intervenes." "The army?" Eleanor asked, alarmed. "Robert sent a message to Fort Davidson with Parker," Thomas said, checking the pistol at his belt. "The commander there, Captain Jeffords, is a fair man. He won't allow Wells to provoke violence based on false accusations." "How can you be sure?" Eleanor couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Thomas's expression was grim. "Because Jeffords knows that if he moves against the Comanche without just cause, there will be war. A war the army cannot afford with the troubles in the Dakota Territory." He moved to the door, peering out at the gathering dusk. "I need to go. Back, watch Wells and his men. Abigail will stay with you." Panic seized Eleanor at the thought of him leaving. "Is that wise? If you're caught, I won't be caught," he said with quiet confidence. "This is what I do. I've been tracking men well, since I was 14. "Be careful," Abigail admonished. "Wells is dangerous when he's drinking, and he holds a special grudge against you after that incident with the fishing boy." Thomas nodded once, then turned to Eleanor. "Stay inside. Keep the lanterns low. The mission can't be seen from the valley, but light carries far at night." "I understand," Eleanor said, gathering her courage. "And thank you. Again." Something flickered in his eyes, concern perhaps, or a more complex emotion she couldn't decipher. Then he was gone, melting into the gathering shadows, with a silence that reminded her forcefully of his heritage. "He moves like a ghost," Abigail commented, lighting one of the lanterns and turning it down to a soft glow. "It's easy to forget he's one of the Army's most valued scouts." "How did that come to be?" Eleanor asked, helping to arrange the blankets. "On the stone floor. A Comanche working for the U.S. Army seems unexpected." Abigail was quiet for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Thomas's story is his to tell," she said finally. "But I can tell you that he made a choice, a difficult one, to protect what remains of his people. The old ways are gone, the buffalo nearly extinct. He believes cooperation offers a better chance for survival than resistance. Not everyone agrees with him, I imagine. No, there are still bands fighting the army, raiding settlements. Every such incident makes life harder for the peaceful Comanche, like Thomas and his kin." Abigail's voice held a depth of understanding that suggested personal investment in the situation. "You and Thomas seem close," Eleanor observed carefully. Abigail's smile was sad. "We share similar goals. Education, tolerance, a future where different peoples can coexist. She unwrapped a cloth bundle containing cornbread and dried apple slices. Eat something. It may be a long night. They ate in silence, listening to the wind outside and the occasional cry of a nighthawk. Eleanor's thoughts churned with all she had learned in the past 24 hours. Gordon Wells, the man she had traveled across the country to marry, was apparently not just an unpleasant character, but actively dangerous. A man willing to fabricate accusations and risk violence to further his ambitions. And then there was Thomas Hawking, a complex figure who navigated between worlds, whose quiet dignity and moral certainty had impressed her despite her initial fears. The way Abigail looked when she spoke of him suggested there might be deeper feelings there, though whether reciprocated, Eleanor couldn't tell. "I've made a terrible mistake, haven't I?" she said finally, voicing the thought that had been growing. Since her arrival at Wishbone Station, Abigail regarded her thoughtfully. "You made a decision based on the information you had at the time. That's not a mistake. It's just life. The real question is what decision you'll make now with better information. What choice do I have? I can't marry Wells, not knowing what I know now. But I have nowhere else to go. No money to return to Boston. No skills that would earn me a living out here." Eleanor fought against the despair threatening to overwhelm her. "You have more options than you realize," Abigail said firmly. "Willow Creek needs a second teacher. The settlement is growing, and I can't manage all the children alone." "Me? A teacher?" Eleanor was startled by the suggestion. "But I have no training. You're educated, which is more than most women in these parts can claim. You can read, write, cipher. That's enough to start." Abigail leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Think about it. You could make a life here, on your own terms." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, to stay in this wild place, not as someone's wife, but as her own person, contributing to a community that seemed to value cooperation over convention. Could she do it? Before she could respond, a sound outside made them both freeze, the soft scrape of boot on stone. Abigail extinguished the lantern in one swift movement, plunging the mission into darkness. Eleanor's heart pounded as footsteps approached the heavy wooden door. "Thomas?" Abigail whispered, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. The door creaked open, and a rectangle of moonlight fell across the stone floor. In it stood the silhouette of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, a rifle cradled in his arms. "Well now," came a voice rough with drink and satisfaction, "what have we here?" A schoolmarm and a runaway bride, hiding in the dark like guilty things. Gordon Wells had found them. Gordon Wells took 2 steps into the mission, moonlight glinting, off his silver belt buckle and the barrel of his rifle. Eleanor could smell the whiskey on him, even from across the room. "Mr. Wells," she said, rising slowly to her feet. "I'm Eleanor Blackwood." "I know who you are," he growled, looking her up and down with a gaze that made her skin crawl. "My bride, the one who never showed at Wishbone Station." "There was a misunderstanding," Eleanor began, struggling to keep her voice steady. "The bridge was washed out. Seems to me the only misunderstanding is why my mail-order bride is hiding in an abandoned mission with the schoolmarm instead of waiting for me like she ought to be." Wells's voice was deceptively soft, but Eleanor sensed dangerous currents beneath the surface calm, unless, of course, she was persuaded not to. Kidnapped, some might say. "That's absurd," Abigail interjected, standing shoulder to shoulder with Eleanor. "Miss Blackwood was stranded at the station. Thomas Hawking found her there alone and brought her to Willow Creek for her own safety." At the mention of Thomas's name, Wells's expression darkened. The Comanche scout. I might have known he'd be mixed up in this. He took another step forward, rifle still cradled in his arms. "Was he here with you ladies? Is he coming back?" "Mr. Wells," Eleanor said firmly, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. I think we should discuss this matter in the morning, when you're more yourself. Wells laughed, a sound without mirth. Oh, I'm exactly myself, Miss Blackwood, maybe more than you'd like. He set his rifle against the wall and pulled a silver flask from his coat pocket, taking a long swallow before continuing. I paid good money to bring you out here, spent weeks fixing up the house, hired a new housekeeper to teach you the ropes. And this is the thanks I get, my bride hiding from me, corrupted by Injun lovers and schoolmarms. He spat the last word as if it were a curse, and Abigail flinched. Eleanor felt a surge of protectiveness toward her new friend. No one has corrupted me, Mr. Wells. I simply had the misfortune of being stranded, and the good fortune of being found by people who showed me kindness. She took a deep breath. And now that we've met, I believe it would be best if our arrangement were reconsidered. For a moment, Wells seemed genuinely puzzled. Reconsidered? There's nothing to reconsider. You signed a contract. I have your letters, your agreement to be my wife in exchange for your passage west. A contract based on incomplete information, Eleanor countered, her law merchant father's teachings coming to her aid. You presented yourself as a respectable rancher. You failed to mention your reputation for violence, your gambling debts, or your political agenda against the Comanche. Wells's face flushed dark in the moonlight. You've been listening to lies and gossip, that Comanche has poisoned you against me. Thomas told me only what I asked him, Eleanor replied. Others have confirmed it. I cannot in good conscience enter into a marriage with a man who— You don't have a choice, Wells snapped, his tentative control slipping. He crossed the distance between them in 2 quick strides and grabbed Eleanor's arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. You're my property. You'll come with me now, and tomorrow we'll be married by the circuit judge in Austin. Let her go. Abigail's voice was steel. She had retrieved Thomas's hunting knife from their supplies and held it with surprising steadiness. Miss Blackwood is not property. She's a free woman who can make her own decisions. Wells eyed the knife and laughed again. You think you can threaten me, schoolmarm? I've faced Apache war parties and Mexican bandits. You think I'm afraid of a spinster with a pig sticker? No, came a new voice from the doorway, but you should be afraid of me. Thomas Hawking stood silhouetted against the night sky, his Springfield, rifle aimed squarely at Wells's chest. His voice was quiet, but carried the undeniable weight of a man prepared to kill if necessary. Wells froze, his grip on Eleanor's arm slackening just enough for her to pull free. She stumbled backward, and Abigail caught her, drawing her safely away from the rancher. This isn't your business, Scout, Wells snarled, turning to face Thomas. The woman is my bride. I have a legal right. You have no right to force any. Woman, Thomas interrupted, and you're trespassing on Apache land. The mission may be abandoned, but it sits on territory protected by treaty. Treaty, Wells sneered. The paper you people hide behind while you send raiding parties against decent folk. The only raiding party here is you, Wells, tracking women, like prey through the night, armed and drunk. Thomas's aim never wavered. You need to leave now! For a tense moment, Eleanor was certain violence would erupt. Wells stood with his hands half raised, rage and calculation warring in his expression. Thomas remained motionless in the doorway, a figure carved from shadow and resolve. Then, unexpectedly, Wells smiled. You've overplayed your hand, Scout. When I ride into Fort Davidson tomorrow and tell Captain Jeffords that a Comanche held me at gunpoint, on top of stealing my bride, how do you think he'll respond? How will the territorial governor respond when the story reaches Austin? He'll respond to the truth, came yet another voice, and Robert Reynolds stepped into view beside Thomas. Which is that you tracked 2 women to an isolated location, threatened them, and laid hands on Miss Blackwood against her will. The doctor looked uncharacteristically formidable, a shotgun braced against his shoulder. Behind him, Eleanor could make out at least 3 other figures, men from Willow Creek, she realized, armed and grim-faced. Wells's confidence faltered visibly. "You're making a mistake, Doc. This isn't your fight. When you threaten members of our community, it becomes our fight," Robert replied evenly. "Miss Blackwood may have come west to marry you, but she's under no obligation to go through with it, especially now that she's seen your true character. And Miss Thornton is one of our own," added a stocky man with a prospector's beard who stepped up beside Robert. "Any man who threatens her answers to all of us." Wells looked from face to face, assessing his odds. Outnumbered and outgunned, he seemed to deflate slightly. "Fine, keep the frigid Boston bitch. She's probably damaged goods anyway." He retrieved his rifle with deliberate slowness. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." He brushed past Thomas and Robert, shouldering his way through the group of Willow Creek men. No one stopped him, though hands tightened on weapons until the sound of hoofbeats marked his departure. Only then did Thomas lower his rifle, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. "He'll be back," he said quietly, "with men, with a story that paints him as the victim." "Then we'd better be prepared," Robert replied, then turned to the women. "Are you both all right?" Eleanor realized she was trembling, reaction setting in. Now that the immediate danger had passed. "Yes," she managed, "though I fear I've brought trouble to your doorstep." "The trouble was already there," Abigail said, setting aside the knife with evident relief. "Wells has been looking for an excuse to move against the Comanche and, by extension, against Willow Creek for harboring them." "How did you find us?" Eleanor asked Robert. "Thomas left to watch Wells, and he saw Wells and 2 of his men heading this way," Robert explained. "Thomas doubled back to the settlement, gathered a few of us who could be trusted. The 2 men with Wells are cooling, their heels in the creek bottom, tied to a couple of sturdy oaks. They'll be uncomfortable but unharmed until morning. We should return to Willow Creek," Thomas said, scanning the darkness outside with watchful eyes. "Wells will regroup with the rest of his men. They were making camp at the North Ridge when I left them." "How many?" asked the bearded man, whom Eleanor now recognized as the blacksmith. 8, counting Wells, all armed. Most of them are new hires, hard cases from down El Paso way. Not the usual ranch hands. Thomas's expression was grim. They didn't come prepared for a social visit. The gravity of the situation settled over the group. Eleanor felt a crushing weight of responsibility. "This is my fault," she said, her voice barely audible. "If I hadn't come, this was inevitable," Thomas cut her off. "Wells has been pushing for confrontation for months. If not you, he would have found another pretext." "Thomas is right," Robert agreed. "But we need to move now, while we have darkness, as cover. The women can ride double with Thomas. His horse is the surest on the trail at night." Eleanor expected Thomas to object to this arrangement, but he merely nodded. "You and the others should spread out, take different routes back. If Wells's men are watching, we don't want to present a single target." The return journey to Willow Creek passed in tense silence. Eleanor rode behind Thomas, arms wrapped reluctantly but necessarily around his waist, while Abigail rode behind the blacksmith on his sturdy draft horse. The men stayed alert, rifles ready, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of ambush. They reached the settlement without incident, but the atmosphere there was charged with apprehension. Lights burned in windows despite the late hour, and armed men patrolled the perimeter. Sarah rushed from the cabin as they dismounted, embracing first her husband, then her brother, relief evident in every line of her body. "Thank God," she breathed. When word came that Wells was heading for the mission, "We're fine," Robert assured her. "Wells won't try anything tonight, not with his force divided, but tomorrow will be another matter." Inside the cabin, a council of sorts had assembled. The community leaders of Willow Creek gathered around the table, faces grave in the lamplight. Elena Martinez, matriarch of the Mexican families, John Two Bears, representing the Apache, Reverend Matthews, who had apparently arrived during the crisis, and several others Eleanor didn't recognize. "The situation is clear," Reverend Matthews was saying as they entered. "Wells means to provoke an incident he can use to sway the territorial authorities against us, particularly against our Comanche and Apache neighbors. He has powerful friends," Two Bears added, his English precise and measured. "The railroad interests want our treaty lands. The cattle barons want the water rights. They need only an excuse. What can we do?" Abigail asked, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah with grateful hands. "Wells won't simply go away, not after being humiliated tonight." "We send for the army," Robert suggested. "Captain Jeffords is a reasonable man. If we present our case, you first. The army is 3 days' ride," Thomas interrupted. "Wells can do much damage in 3 days. "Then we defend ourselves," said the blacksmith stubbornly. "We have capable men, weapons, and risk being branded renegades?" Reverend Matthews shook his head. "Violence will only serve Wells' purpose, even if provoked." Eleanor listened to the debate, aware that she had become the unwitting catalyst for a conflict that had been brewing long before her arrival. Her practical Boston upbringing urged her to find a solution, a compromise that would diffuse the situation. "What about the law?" she asked suddenly, drawing all eyes to her. "Not the army, but the civilian authorities. Is there a marshal, a sheriff?" "Marshal Davis in Meridian," John Two Bears replied. "A fair man from what I hear, but it was also a hard 3 days hard ride, unless someone could catch the eastbound train at Wishbone Station," Eleanor persisted. "It passes through Meridian, doesn't it?" "It does," Robert confirmed slowly, "and it's due tomorrow morning, but the creek crossing is dangerous but possible," Thomas finished. "I could make it. Bring the marshal back in the afternoon westbound." Hope flickered across the gathered faces, but Elena Martinez frowned. "Wells will be watching the trails. He knows we'll try to summon help." "I know paths he doesn't," Thomas said with quiet confidence. "Ways through the hills that only the Comanche remember." "It's too risky," Sarah protested. "If Wells catches you alone, there is no safe choice here," Thomas replied, his gaze finding Eleanor's across the room, "only necessary ones." The debate continued late into the night, strategies proposed and discarded, options weighed and measured against the stark reality of their situation. Eventually, a plan emerged. Thomas would ride for Wishbone Station before dawn, taking the hidden paths to avoid Wells's men. Meanwhile, the people of Willow Creek would present a united but non-threatening front, going about their business as usual while maintaining discreet armed patrols. If Wells believes we're waiting passively for help, he may hold off on direct action, Reverend Matthews reasoned. His goal is to provoke us into violence that will justify his claims. As the meeting dispersed, people returning to their homes with new purpose, if not complete confidence, Eleanor found herself alone with Thomas in the small stable behind the cabin. He was preparing his horse for the dangerous journey, checking the saddle, the rifle scabbard, the small pack of provisions Sarah had hastily assembled. "I want to thank you," she said quietly, watching his efficient movements in the lantern light, "for risking your life again." Thomas paused, then resumed his work without looking at her. "I do what must be done. For a community that includes those who once were enemies," Eleanor observed, "and for a woman you've only just met," his hands stilled on the saddle strap. "You're part of Willow Creek now, whether you intended it or not. We protect our own." The simple declaration moved Eleanor more than any flowery speech could have. In Boston, she'd been her parents' daughter, defined by family connections and social standing. Here, in this raw frontier settlement, she had been accepted based solely on her present need and future potential. "I may have come west for the wrong reasons," she admitted, But perhaps I've ended up in the right place after all. Thomas turned to her then, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Abigail says you're considering staying, teaching. It's an idea, Eleanor said, surprised that he knew of it. I have some education, though not formal training. Education is valuable here. More valuable than in the East, perhaps, where there are fewer opportunities to acquire it. He secured the last strap and ran a hand along his horse's flank. My sister learned to read at a mission school after she was returned to her white family. It changed her life, gave her choices. Is that why you support Abigail's school? Because of Sarah? Thomas considered this. Partly. And partly because I've seen what happens to peoples who cannot read the treaties signed in their name or the laws that govern their lives. There was an old pain in his voice, a wound that had scarred but never fully healed. I admire what you've built here, Eleanor said softly. This community. It's unlike anything I've seen or imagined. It is fragile, he replied, his tone dropping. Like new growth after a prairie fire, easy to crush if not protected. He checked his weapons, rifle, knife, pistol, with the same methodical care he had shown with his horse. Wells and men like him would destroy it without thought to satisfy their greed. Eleanor was struck by the depth of his commitment, his willingness to risk everything for a vision of coexistence that much of the country would find radical, even dangerous. You must think me very naive, she said, to have come all this way to marry a man like Wells. No, Thomas replied, surprising her. Desperate, perhaps, but not naive. Many come west seeking something, safety, opportunity, a new beginning. The reasons don't matter as much as what they do once they arrive. His assessment was closer to the truth than Eleanor cared to admit. Her decision to become a mail-order bride had been born of financial necessity and limited options. But now, facing this man who had carved out a path of integrity in a world that offered him few choices, her own capitulation to circumstance seemed shamefully inadequate. "And what would you have me do now that I've arrived?" she asked, half expecting him to suggest she return east at the first opportunity. Thomas secured his saddlebag before answering. "That is for you to decide. But I think you have courage. You stood against Wells when many would have yielded out of fear." "It wasn't courage," Eleanor protested. "It was self-preservation. Sometimes they are the same." He paused, then added with unexpected gentleness, "My grandmother would say you have a strong spirit. That is a high compliment among my people." The praise warmed Eleanor in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Your grandmother, is she still living?" "No, she died when I was 15, before the treaties, before the reservations." His voice held no self-pity, only a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of loss. "She taught me the old ways, even as she told me they were ending. She said our people must learn to walk new paths without forgetting the wisdom of the ancient ones." "She sounds remarkable." She was. For a moment, remembered affection softened his features, making him appear younger, more approachable. Then the warrior's mask returned. "I should go. There are still 4 hours until dawn, enough time to reach the station before the eastbound train." "Be careful," Eleanor said, the words inadequate to express her concern. "Wells are dangerous." "I know Wells," Thomas replied, leading his horse from the stable. "I know his kind. They believe their badges and their names and their money make them untouchable." His voice hardened. "They are wrong." In the yard, Robert and Sarah waited to bid him farewell. The doctor handed Thomas a small medical kit, while Sarah pressed something into his hand that Eleanor couldn't see. An amulet of some kind, perhaps, or a token for luck. Eleanor stood apart, acutely aware of being an outsider, in this moment of family concern. Yet when Thomas mounted his horse, his gaze found hers in the darkness. No words passed between them, but something did. an understanding, a connection forged in the crucible of shared danger. Then he was gone, melting into the pre-dawn darkness like a shadow, leaving Eleanor with the unsettling realization that somewhere between Wishbone Station and this moment, her future had become inextricably linked with Willow Creek and its unlikely defender. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the recent rains already surrendering to the relentless Texas sun. Eleanor rose early, having slept fitfully on Sarah's pallet. The cabin felt emptier without Thomas's quiet presence, though she chided herself for noting his absence so keenly after such a brief acquaintance. Abigail arrived as they were finishing a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, her face drawn with worry, but her manner brisk and determined. "School will continue as usual," she announced. "We've agreed that maintaining normalcy is important, especially for the children." "I'd like to help," Eleanor offered impulsively. "In the school. If I'm to consider teaching here, I should learn your methods." Surprise and pleasure brightened Abigail's tired features. "I'd welcome the assistance. The children will be unsettled today. They know something's amiss, though. We've tried to shield them from the details." As they walked together toward the small schoolhouse, Eleanor noted the heightened vigilance in the settlement, men carrying rifles as they went about their morning chores, women keeping the younger children close, older boys stationed as lookouts. On rooftops and in trees, "What will happen if Thomas doesn't reach the marshal in time?" she asked quietly. Abigail's expression remained resolute. "Then we face whatever comes together. Willow Creek has weathered threats before, drought, disease, bandits. Wells is just another storm to endure." But her confidence seemed forced, and Eleanor suspected that this particular storm might prove more devastating than any that had come before. Because of her. Because she had unwittingly provided Wells with the pretext he needed to move against the community he despised. As they reached the schoolhouse, a rider appeared on the north ridge, a single figure silhouetted against the morning sun. Not Thomas, returning impossibly early, but a stranger, a harbinger, perhaps, of what was to come. Abigail grabbed Eleanor's arm, her fingers digging in with sudden urgency. "Get inside," she ordered, "quickly." Behind them, the warning spread through Willow Creek. A man's shout, a woman's cry, the sudden clamor of a bell. From the direction of the ridge came more riders, at least a dozen, their approach deliberate and menacing. Gordon Wells had returned, and he had brought reinforcements. The riders approached Willow Creek in a loose formation, dust rising behind them in the morning light. Gordon Wells rode at their head, flanked by two men in weather-beaten dusters who carried rifles across their saddles with the casual ease of those accustomed to violence. "Those aren't ranch hands," Robert Reynolds muttered, joining Eleanor and Abigail outside the schoolhouse. "Hired guns from the look of them." "The children," Abigail said urgently. "We need to get them somewhere. Safe." "The root cellar at the Martinez place," Robert decided. "Elena will take them through the back gardens. Wells won't risk shooting women and children, not with witnesses." Eleanor watched as the settlement mobilized with practiced efficiency. Women gathered the children, leading them away in small groups that wouldn't attract attention. Men took up defensive positions, not obviously threatening, but prepared to respond if necessary. "What about you?" Robert asked, turning to Eleanor. "Wells is here for you. If you're visible, it might provoke him, or it might give us an opportunity to reason with him," Eleanor countered, surprising herself with her own resolve. "If I hide, he'll only use it as evidence that I'm being held against my will." "She's right," Abigail said reluctantly. "And we need to buy time for Thomas to reach." "The marshal," Robert looked between the two women, clearly torn. "At least stay back out of immediate reach. If Wells tries to grab you again, he won't succeed," Eleanor assured him, though her racing heart belied her confident words. Wells and his men reined in at the edge of the settlement, just beyond the first scatter of buildings. The ranches. Gaze swept the gathered townsfolk until it found Eleanor. A smile that held no warmth curved his mouth. "Miss Blackwood," he called, his voice carrying easily in the morning stillness. "I've come to escort you home. Your real home, at Copper Creek Ranch." Eleanor stepped forward, ignoring Robert's warning hand on her arm. "Mr. Wells, I believe I made my position clear last night. I will not be accompanying you anywhere." Wells's smile didn't falter. "I understand you might be confused, even frightened. After your ordeal, being abducted, held against your will, it would unsettle anyone." "I wasn't abducted," Eleanor responded firmly. "I was assisted by Mr. Hawking when left stranded at Wishbone Station." "That's your story now," Wells agreed with false sympathy. "After they've had time to work on you. But I have witnesses who saw the Comanche scout forcing you onto his horse." He gestured to one of the men beside him, a sallow-faced individual with a nervous tick at the corner of his mouth. "Isn't that right, Jenkins?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Wells," the man responded promptly. "Saw it plain as day. That Injun scout had the lady at gunpoint, making her mount up. She was struggling something fierce." The bold-faced lie stunned Eleanor momentarily. "That's absolutely false. I went willingly, grateful for the assistance." "Of course you'd say that now," Wells continued in the same reasonable tone. "They've threatened you, turned you against me. It's a common tactic among savages. Confuse. They're captives. Make them dependent." "This is absurd," Robert interjected, stepping up beside Eleanor. "Everyone here knows Thomas Hawking. He's a respected scout for the U.S. Army. The notion that he would kidnap a white woman is preposterous." "Is it?" Wells raised an eyebrow. "Did you know that your respected scout was once captured by the Army for raiding settlements along the Red River? That he only saved his neck by agreeing to scout against his own people? Ask him about the Mason family sometime, if he ever returns from whatever errand sent him scurrying away at dawn." Eleanor saw uncertainty flicker across some faces in the crowd. Wells was clever, sowing seeds of doubt, exploiting the racial tensions that simmered beneath Willow Creek's veneer of harmony. "Whatever Mr. Hawking's past," she said clearly, "his present conduct has been nothing but honorable. Which is more than I can say for you, Mr. Wells. Fabricating accusations, arriving with armed men to intimidate a peaceful settlement. These are hardly the actions of an honorable suitor." Wells's facade of reasonableness slipped slightly. "I've come prepared for resistance because I know what I'm dealing with. Half-breeds, Mexicans, Apache sympathizers, people who've chosen to stand against progress, against civilization." His voice hardened. "I've brought men to ensure my lawful bride is returned to me safely, nothing more. Miss Blackwood is not your property," Abigail declared, her voice ringing out across the tense gathering. "She's a free woman who can choose whom she marries." "Is that so, Miss Thornton?" Wells's attention shifted to the schoolteacher, his expression calculating. "And I suppose you've been helping her understand her options, perhaps suggesting that she stay here, in your little experiment of a settlement." He chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "How convenient for you. Another educated white woman to lend legitimacy to your mixed-blood school." Eleanor felt a surge of anger at his thinly veiled contempt. "Mr. Wells, this conversation is pointless. I will not marry you. Not now, not ever. Whatever agreement we had is nullified by your conduct and the misrepresentations in your letters." "I have a legally binding contract," Wells countered. "Signed by you, witnessed and notarized in Boston. You accepted my money for passage. You agreed to be my wife." He pulled a folded document from his coat. "The territorial court will uphold it." Eleanor felt a chill. She had indeed signed such an agreement, in the office of Mr. Pickering, her father's former colleague. At the time, it had seemed a practical business arrangement, no different from the contracts her father had negotiated throughout his career. Contracts, obtained through fraud are not enforceable, she said, grasping at half-remembered legal principles. You misrepresented yourself and your circumstances. Did I? Wells seemed amused by her attempt at legal argument. My letter described a working cattle ranch in need of a proper mistress. That's exactly what Copper Creek is. The fact that you've developed a sudden preference for alternative company doesn't invalidate our agreement. The innuendo behind his words was clear, and Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with angry embarrassment. Before she could respond, Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his clerical collar a stark white against his black coat. Mr. Wells, as a man of God, I cannot stand by while you attempt to force a woman into marriage against her will. The sanctity of marriage requires free consent from both parties. Sanctity, Wells laughed. This was a business transaction, Reverend. She sold herself fair and square. Now she's refusing to deliver the goods. Murmurs of outrage rippled through the Willow Creek residence. Even some of Wells's own men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles at his crude characterization. Reverend Matthews remained unruffled. Regardless of how the arrangement began, Miss Blackwood has made her position clear. As Christians and as civilized people, we must respect her decision. And if I don't, Wells's hand drifted to the pistol at his hip. What then, Reverend? Will you and your flock of misfits stop me by force? Because I assure you, my men and I are prepared for that eventuality. The threat hung in the air, accentuated by the subtle shifting of the hired guns to more advantageous positions. Robert moved closer to Eleanor, his body angled protectively. There's no need for violence, the doctor said, his voice steady despite the tension thrumming through the group. The marshal from Meridian is on his way. This is a matter for the proper authorities. Wells's eyes narrowed. The marshal? And who sent for him, I wonder? Your Comanche scout, perhaps, riding hard for Wishbone Station at dawn? He shook his head slowly. A wasted journey, I'm afraid. The telegraph line to Meridian suffered an unfortunate accident last night, and the eastbound train won't be stopping at Wishbone today. A tree fell across the tracks, most inconvenient. Eleanor felt a wave of dismay. Wells had anticipated their plan, countering it with ruthless efficiency. And Thomas, what would happen when he reached the station expecting the train? So, you see, Wells continued with satisfaction, we have time to resolve this privately, among ourselves. No need to involve outside authorities who might not understand the delicate balance of your little community here. The threat was thinly veiled. If the territorial authorities became involved, questions would be raised about the mixed-race nature of Willow Creek, the presence of Comanche living freely rather than on reservations, the unconventional arrangements that allowed the settlement to function. What do you want, Wells? Robert asked bluntly. Beyond Miss Blackwood, whom you cannot have, Wells appeared to consider the question, though Eleanor suspected his demands were already prepared. Compensation, he said finally. For my expenses, my wasted time, the damage to my reputation, $5,000 should cover it. That's extortion, Abigail exclaimed. You know this settlement doesn't have that kind of money. Then land, Wells countered smoothly. The water rights to Willow Creek and the southern grazing meadows. My cattle need reliable water, especially in drought years. John Two Bears stepped forward, his weathered face impassive but his eyes burning with controlled anger. Those meadows are treaty land, guaranteed to the Apache people by the federal government. Treaties can be reinterpreted, Wells said dismissively, especially when there's evidence of Apache collaboration with renegade Comanche. Or had you forgotten your friendship with Thomas Hawking? Eleanor watched in growing horror as Wells systematically threatened everything Willow Creek had built, their autonomy, their water rights, their precarious harmony between races. And all because of her, because she had unwittingly given him the leverage he needed. This isn't just about me, she said quietly to Robert. He's using me as an excuse to take what he's always wanted. Of course he is, Robert agreed grimly. Wells has been circling this settlement like a vulture since it was founded. He hates what we represent: cooperation, racial mixing, shared resources, everything that threatens his vision of a white man's Texas. Then I should go with him, Eleanor decided, steeling herself. Remove the pretext for his threats. No, Abigail's hand closed around her wrist. That's exactly what he wants, to break us by making a sacrifice one of our own. Because once we do that, where does it end? The next time he wants something, who will we give up? Eleanor was startled by the inclusion, one of our own, but touched by it as well. In just 2 days, she had been accepted into this community in ways she had never experienced in Boston, where her family's reduced circumstances had gradually eroded her social standing. There must be another way, she whispered. As if in answer, a commotion arose from the direction of the creek, riders approaching, not from the direction of Wishbone Station, but from the east. Eleanor's heart leaped with hope, then fell again. It couldn't be Thomas, not so soon, and not from that direction. Wells twisted in his saddle, scowling at the interruption. Who the hell? The newcomers came into view. 4 men in the distinctive blue uniforms of the U.S. Cavalry, led by an officer whose bearing suggested authority. Behind them rode Thomas Hawking, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene before him. Captain Jeffords, Robert breathed, relief evident in his voice. From Fort Davidson. The cavalry officer reined in his horse, assessing the situation. With a practiced eye, Wells and his men on one side, the townspeople of Willow Creek on the other, tension crackling between them. Mr. Wells, he acknowledged with a curt nod. Dr. Reynolds, Miss Thornton. His gaze settled on Eleanor. And you must be Miss Blackwood. I understand there's some disagreement about your status. Before Eleanor could respond, Wells interjected, Captain Jeffords, I'm relieved you're here. These people have been harboring my fiancée against her will. I came peacefully to reclaim her, only to be met with threats and resistance. That's a lie, Eleanor said firmly. Mr. Wells has been threatening this settlement, demanding water rights and money in exchange for releasing me from an agreement I entered under false pretenses. Jeffords held up a hand. One at a time, if you please. He turned to Thomas, who had dismounted and stood slightly apart from the group. Scout Hawking, report. How did you come to be involved in this matter? Thomas stepped forward, his demeanor professional, his voice measured. I found Miss Blackwood at Wishbone Station 2 days ago, sir, alone after the train departed. The bridge to Copper Creek was washed out. Night was falling, predators in the area. I brought her to Willow Creek for safety. And did you force her to accompany you? Jeffords asked, his tone neutral. No, sir. She came willingly after considering her options. He's lying, Wells interrupted. I have witnesses who saw him abduct her at gunpoint. The same witnesses. Who helped you sabotage the telegraph line to Meridian? Thomas countered, a rare flash of anger breaking through his composed exterior. The same men who felled a tree across the railroad tracks? Jeffords's eyebrows rose. Serious accusations, Scout Hawking. Do you have evidence? 2 of Wells's men caught in the act, sir. Tied up at the ranger station 3 miles east of here. The patrol found them this morning, which is why I met you on the trail instead of at Fort Davidson as planned. Eleanor watched Wells's expression darken as his schemes unraveled. The rancher had clearly not anticipated the cavalry's involvement, nor Thomas's resourcefulness in adapting when the original plan to fetch the marshal failed. Captain, whatever else has occurred, the fact remains that Miss Blackwood is my contracted bride. Wells persisted, producing the document again. I have legal rights that supersede any misunderstandings. Jeffords studied the paper, then looked to Eleanor. Miss Blackwood, do you acknowledge signing this agreement? I do, she admitted, but I've since learned information about Mr. Wells that invalidates it. He misrepresented himself and his circumstances, and now he threatens violence against this settlement if I don't comply." The captain considered this, his weathered face giving nothing away. "Marriage contracts are civil matters outside military jurisdiction," he said finally. "However, tampering with telegraph lines and sabotaging railroad tracks are federal offenses. You have no proof I was involved," Wells snapped. "Only the word of a Comanche and whatever drifters he paid to lie for him." "I have the sworn testimony of 2 of your own men, Mr. Wells," Jeffords replied evenly. "Men who were promised double wages to create distractions that would prevent outside interference. Men who are now very eager to cooperate in exchange for leniency." Wells's face flushed dark with anger. "This is a conspiracy. The army taking the side of Indians against white settlers. Wait until the governor hears of this." "By all means take your complaints to the governor," Jeffords said, unmoved. "But first, you and your men will accompany us back to Fort Davidson to answer questions about the sabotage." "This is outrageous," Wells sputtered, but his hired guns were already exchanging uneasy glances, clearly calculating whether their pay justified standing against the U.S. cavalry. "Additionally," Jeffords continued, "I would strongly advise you to reconsider your claim on Miss Blackwood. Forced marriage does not sit well with territorial judges, regardless of what papers may have been signed in Boston." Eleanor felt a wave of relief so profound her knees nearly buckled. Robert steadied her with a discreet hand under her elbow. Wells glared at her with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," he promised in a low voice meant only for her. "You've made an enemy today, Miss Blackwood, you and your Comanche protector." "That sounded remarkably like a threat, Mr. Wells," Captain Jeffords observed mildly. "I wouldn't advise adding intimidation of witnesses to your list of problems." He nodded to his men. "Escort Mr. Wells and his companions to the fort. I'll join you shortly." As the cavalry troopers surrounded Wells and his hired guns, the tension that had gripped Willow Creek began to dissipate. People moved closer together, exchanging relieved glances and murmured comments. Abigail squeezed Eleanor's hand. "It's over," she whispered. "At least for now." Eleanor watched as Wells and his men were led away, the rancher's straight back and rigid posture betraying his fury. "Will the charges against him be serious enough to keep him occupied?" she asked Robert. "Tampering with federal communications carries significant penalties," the doctor replied, "and Captain Jeffords is thorough. He'll investigate every aspect of Wells's activities once he has him at the fort." Thomas approached them, his expression guarded yet somehow lighter than before. "Wells has enemies in Austin," he added. "Creditors, men he's cheated. Once word spreads that he's under investigation, they'll circle like wolves." Captain Jeffords rejoined them after ensuring Wells's departure, removing his hat to wipe his brow in the growing heat. "That man has been a thorn in my side for 2 years, he confessed, always pushing boundaries, testing the limits of what he can get away with. I'm grateful for the opportunity to finally hold him accountable." "Thank you, Captain," Eleanor said. "Sincerely. I shudder to think what might have happened if you hadn't arrived when you did." "Thank Scout Hawking," Jeffords replied with a nod toward Thomas. "When he couldn't reach Wishbone Station due to Wells's meddling, he took an old Comanche trail through the eastern hills. Must have ridden all night to intercept my patrol at dawn." Eleanor turned to Thomas, seeing for the first time the signs of exhaustion he had carefully concealed. The shadows beneath his eyes, the dust that coated his clothing, the slight stiffness in his movements. "You rode all night?" she asked, a strange emotion tightening her chest. "Without rest?" Thomas shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "It was necessary. It was brave," she corrected softly. "And I am in your debt. Again." "There is no debt between people who walk the same path," he replied, the Comanche cadence more pronounced in his voice than usual, perhaps due to fatigue. Captain Jeffords cleared his throat. "Miss Blackwood, I must ask about your plans now. Do you wish to return east? The army could arrange passage under the circumstances." The question caught Eleanor off guard. Return east? To what? Her parents' cramped apartment, the pitying glances of former friends, the relentless struggle against genteel poverty. The Boston she had left behind offered nothing but diminishing prospects and fading dreams. "No," she said, surprising herself, with the conviction in her voice. "I came west to build a new life. That hasn't changed, even if the specifics have." "She's staying with us," Abigail announced, her arm slipping around Eleanor's waist in a gesture of solidarity. "Willow Creek needs another teacher, and Eleanor has already shown she has the necessary backbone." Captain Jeffords smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. "I'm glad to hear it. Willow Creek is a unique experiment, one I've come to believe is worth protecting." He replaced his hat. "I should join my men. Wells will be trouble. Enough without giving him time to concoct some new scheme." As the captain mounted his horse, Eleanor noticed Thomas sway slightly, fatigue finally overtaking his iron self-control. Without thinking, she moved to his side, offering support with a light touch on his arm. "You need rest," she said quietly, brooking no argument. To her surprise, he didn't pull away, but instead allowed her to guide him toward the cabin he shared with Sarah and Robert. "Just for a few hours," he conceded. "There is still much to do." Sarah met them at the door, her expression shifting from relief to concern as she assessed her brother's condition. "Inside," she ordered. "Food, then sleep." As Thomas disappeared into the cabin, Eleanor remained on the porch, watching the settlement return to its normal rhythms. Children emerging from hiding, men storing away weapons, women resuming interrupted tasks. It struck her that this place, which had seemed so alien just days ago, already felt more like home than Boston had in years. "He'll be all right," Sarah assured her, misinterpreting her lingering presence. "Thomas has endured far worse than a night, without sleep." "I know," Eleanor said. "He's remarkable." Sarah studied her with knowing eyes. "Yes, he is, though few outside our family see it." She hesitated, then added, "You should know that his path is not an easy one. He walks between worlds, not fully accepted in either. It can be a lonely journey." "I'm beginning to understand that," Eleanor replied softly, "though I can't claim to know what it truly means." "No," Sarah agreed, "but you're learning, and that's more than most ever attempt." She touched Eleanor's arm lightly. "Now come inside. There's stew on the stove, and after everything that's happened, you must be hungry." As Eleanor followed Sarah into the cabin, she glanced back at Willow Creek, this improbable community built on cooperation and mutual need rather than shared backgrounds or beliefs. 3 days ago, she had arrived at Wishbone Station expecting to begin a conventional life as a rancher's wife. Instead, she had found herself in the middle of a struggle for the soul of the frontier itself. And somehow, against all expectation, she had found her place within it. A week passed in relative calm. The creek receded to its normal boundaries. The mud dried under the relentless Texas sun, and daily routines resumed in Willow Creek. For Eleanor, each day brought new revelations as she acclimated to life in the frontier settlement. She had begun assisting Abigail at the school, initially observing the unusual teaching methods that accommodated children from diverse backgrounds. Some spoke primarily Spanish or Apache dialects with limited English. Others had never held a book before arriving at Willow Creek, yet Abigail approached each child with the same blend of patience and high expectations, creating an environment where learning flourished despite material limitations. By the end of the week, Eleanor had taken on teaching the youngest children their letters and numbers, freeing Abigail to work with the older students on more advanced subjects. The arrangement benefited everyone. The children received more individual attention, Abigail could focus her efforts where most needed, and Eleanor discovered a sense of purpose that had eluded her in Boston. "You have a talent for this, Abigail," remarked one afternoon as they cleaned the schoolhouse after dismissing the children. "The little ones respond to you." Eleanor smiled, erasing arithmetic exercises from the slate board. "I enjoy their enthusiasm. Everything is new to them, exciting. Even learning to write the letter A is a triumph worth celebrating." "That's exactly the attitude that makes a good teacher," Abigail said, stacking primers on a shelf. "Too many see only what the children lack: knowledge, proper speech, refined manners. You see their potential." The observation pleased Eleanor, though she deflected the praise. "I'm following your example, and I have much to learn about teaching in these circumstances." She gestured to the sparse classroom with its mismatched furniture and limited supplies. "In Boston, schools have proper desks, abundant books, dedicated buildings. And yet they fail many children," Abigail countered, "especially those born to the wrong parents or in the wrong neighborhoods. Here we make do with less, but we reach everyone." She brushed chalk dust from her skirt. "Speaking of making do, Reverend Matthews brought more books from his circuit. Would you like to help me sort them later?" The prospect of new reading material was enticing. Eleanor had finished the few books she'd brought from Boston and was hungry for fresh words. "I'd love to, though I should check on my trunk first." Now that the way to Wishbone Station is passable again, the forgotten trunk had been recovered 3 days earlier by Thomas and Robert after the bridge was temporarily repaired. Eleanor had been relieved to find its contents largely undisturbed, though dampened by rain that had seeped through the lid. Her clothes now hung drying in Sarah's yard, her books carefully arranged near the fireplace to draw out the moisture. "Of course," Abigail nodded. "We'll meet at my cabin after supper. Grandmother Bluefeather sent over some wild honey, and I've been saving it for a special occasion." As they parted ways outside the schoolhouse, Eleanor noticed Thomas emerging. From the trading post that served as Willow Creek's general store and post office, he carried a small package wrapped in brown paper, his expression thoughtful as he walked toward the edge of the settlement. In the week since Wells's departure, Eleanor had seen little of the Comanche scout. After resting briefly at his sister's cabin, he had been called away to Fort Davidson, where Captain Jeffords required his testimony regarding Wells's activities. He had returned only yesterday, sharing little about the proceedings beyond the fact that Wells faced serious charges. Acting on impulse, Eleanor changed direction to intercept him. "Mr. Hawking!" she called. Thomas paused, waiting for her to catch up. "Miss Blackwood?" he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I heard you returned from the fort," she said, suddenly uncertain what she had meant to say. "I hope all went well with your testimony." "Well enough," he replied. "Wells is being held pending trial in Austin. His creditors have seized most of his assets in the meantime. Then he won't be troubling Willow Creek again soon." The prospect of Wells's permanent removal from their lives was almost too good to believe. "Not for some time," Thomas confirmed, "though men like Wells rarely disappear completely. They have connections, resources hidden away." He shifted the package in his hands. "I was about to ride out to the eastern ridge. Would you care to walk with me as far as the creek?" The invitation surprised Eleanor, coming from a man who rarely sought company. "I would, thank you." They walked in comfortable silence through the settlement, past the scatter of cabins and small gardens, toward the cottonwood grove that lined Willow Creek. Birds darted among the branches, their songs a counterpoint to the gentle murmur of flowing water. "Sarah tells me you're teaching at the school now," Thomas said as they reached the creek bank. "Assisting only," Eleanor clarified. Abigail is a gifted teacher. I'm learning from her. She speaks highly of you. Thomas set his package down on a flat rock and gestured to a fallen log nearby. She says the Apache children trust you, which is unusual for someone so new. Eleanor sat, smoothing her skirts as she considered this. Children know when they're respected, regardless of background. I try to see each one as an individual, not as a representative of their race or circumstances. A rare perspective, Thomas observed, remaining standing. Most whites see only Indian children or Mexican children, defined first by what separates them, not by what they share. Perhaps that's because most whites have the luxury of seeing themselves as individuals first, not as members of a group, Eleanor suggested. When you've never been judged by your heritage alone, it's easy to forget the burden that judgment places on others. Thomas studied her with new interest, as if reassessing his understanding of her. You've thought about this? Recently, yes. Eleanor glanced at the sun-dappled water. In Boston, I was judged by my family's declining fortunes, but never by my fundamental right to exist in society. Here, I've observed how differently people are treated based on their birth, their language, the color of their skin. She looked up at him. It seems a poor measure of human worth. Something in Thomas's expression softened, not quite a smile, but a lessening of the guardedness he typically maintained. Sarah said you were different, adaptable. She was right. The assessment pleased Eleanor more than it perhaps should have. Necessity breeds adaptation, I suppose. Though I must admit, when I first arrived at Wishbone Station, I never imagined I would end up teaching in a settlement like Willow Creek. Life rarely follows the paths we imagine, Thomas agreed. He reached for his package, then hesitated. I brought something for you, from Fort Davidson. For me? Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise as he handed her the small parcel. Open it, he encouraged, an unusual hint of anticipation in his voice. Eleanor carefully unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a book, a well-worn copy of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. She ran her fingers over the embossed cover momentarily, speechless with delight. Captain Jeffords's wife had finished reading it, Thomas explained. When I mentioned you were teaching at Willow Creek, she insisted you should have it. Books are scarce on the frontier. It's wonderful, Eleanor breathed, opening the cover to inhale the familiar scent of paper and ink. Please convey my deepest thanks to Mrs. Jeffords. This is a treasure out here. You've read it before, Thomas asked, seeming genuinely curious. Yes, but my copy remained in Boston. It was too heavy to bring along with the practical necessities. Eleanor closed the book carefully. Literature becomes even more precious when it's rare. In Boston, I took the availability of books for granted. My sister feels the same way, Thomas said. She reads everything she can find, then trades with the army wives and travelers passing through, says books are windows to worlds beyond our own. She's right, Eleanor agreed warmly. Though I'm finding that this world, this place, has more depth and complexity than I ever imagined from Boston. Thomas nodded, then glanced at the sun's position. I should go. I'm expected to be at the eastern lookout before sunset. Of course. Eleanor stood, clutching the book to her chest. Thank you again for thinking of me. It seemed fitting, he said simply. A story set on the moors, wild, untamed country, not unlike the Texas frontier. He lifted his hand in a brief farewell and headed toward where his horse was tethered at the edge of the cottonwoods. Eleanor watched him go, struck by the unexpected thoughtfulness of his gift. Thomas Hawking remained an enigma in many ways, reserved, vigilant, moving between cultures with a grace that belied the difficulty of his position. Yet he had noticed her love of books, remembered it, and gone out of his way to bring her one. She walked back toward the settlement. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to her former fiancé. Gordon Wells had never asked about her interests or preferences during their correspondence. His letters had focused on practical matters, the size of his ranch, the duties she would assume as his wife, the social position she would occupy in the community. Not once had he inquired about what she enjoyed reading or what skills she might bring beyond those expected of any well-bred wife. The contrast between the two men could hardly be more stark, though comparing them felt inappropriate. Wells had been a potential husband, while Thomas was, what exactly? A friend? A protector? A member of the community she was gradually joining? Eleanor pushed the confusing thoughts aside as she reached Sarah and Robert's cabin, where she had continued to stay while more permanent arrangements were discussed. She found Sarah in the yard, hanging laundry on a line stretched between two cottonwoods. "There you are," Sarah greeted her. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd been detained at the school." "I took a walk with your brother," Eleanor explained, showing her the book. "He brought this from Fort Davidson." Sarah examined the volume with an appreciative eye. "Emily Bronte, one of my favorites." She gave Eleanor a speculative look. "Thomas rarely thinks of such things. He must hold you in high regard." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "He said it was from Captain Jeffords's wife." "I'm sure it was," Sarah agreed, her smile knowing, "but Thomas would not have bothered to bring it unless he thought it important." She returned to hanging laundry. "My brother is not demonstrative, but he notices everything, remembers everything." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, hoofbeats announced a rider approaching at speed. Thomas appeared, riding hard from the direction of the eastern ridge, his expression grim. Robert emerged from his makeshift clinic next door, alerted by the commotion. "Thomas? What is it?" Thomas reined in sharply. "Riders coming, not the army, not peaceful." He dismounted in one fluid motion. At least 20, maybe more, armed, moving in formation. A chill ran through Eleanor. Wells's men? No. Thomas's eyes met hers briefly. "Comanche. War party. Flying the red banner," Sarah gasped. "Are you certain? The peace treaty—" A band doesn't recognize the treaty," Thomas cut her off. "They're led by Black Hawk. He has refused to accept the reservation boundaries or the Army's authority." "But why attack Willow Creek?" Robert asked, his medical instincts already prompting him to mentally inventory his supplies. "We've maintained good relations with all the local tribes." "Not an attack," Thomas corrected grimly. "A raid. They'll take horses, supplies, anything of value." He hesitated. "And women if they can." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Women. To replace those lost to smallpox last winter," Thomas explained, his voice carefully neutral. "Black Hawk lost 2 wives and 3 children to the disease. He blames the white man's medicine for failing them." "How much time do we have?" Robert demanded. "An hour, maybe less." Thomas was already moving toward the center of the settlement. "We need to gather everyone in the church. Stone walls, defensible position." The next hour passed in a blur of controlled urgency. Word spread rapidly through Willow Creek, and people responded with the efficiency born of frontier life, where threats were common and survival depended on swift action. Children were gathered, essential supplies collected, weapons distributed to those who could use them. Eleanor found herself working alongside Abigail, helping to organize the younger children and calm their fears as they were hurried into the stone church. The building's thick walls and narrow windows, once designed to repel Apache attacks against Spanish missionaries, now offered protection against a different threat. "Stay away from the windows," Abigail instructed the children, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "This is just like one of our storm drills. Remember those? We stay quiet and follow instructions." Eleanor admired her friend's composure. Her own heart raced, her mind filled with images gleaned from newspaper accounts of frontier violence, scalping, torture, captivity. Yet she forced herself to project calm for the children's sake. leading them in quiet singing games to distract them from the adults' worried conversations. Thomas, Robert, and the other men of Willow Creek moved with purpose, positioning themselves strategically throughout the building. Elena Martinez and the other women prepared bandages and basic medical supplies, faces grim but determined. "Will they really attack?" Eleanor asked Thomas when he passed near her position. "Even with so many people gathered together?" "Black Hawk is proud, angry," Thomas replied, checking the loading of his rifle. "He sees cooperation with whites as weakness. It makes him even more determined to demonstrate his power." "But you're Comanche," Eleanor pointed out. "Surely your presence here makes me a traitor in his eyes," Thomas finished. "Someone who has abandoned the old ways for the comfort of the white man's world." The stark assessment troubled Eleanor. "Is that how you see yourself?" she asked quietly. Thomas paused, his dark eyes meeting hers directly. "I see myself as someone trying to ensure my people have a future, even if it's not the future our ancestors imagined." He moved away before she could respond, joining John Two Bears near the main door. Through the narrow windows, Eleanor could see the sun beginning its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the settlement. The ordinary beauty of the evening stood in stark contrast to the tension within the church, where children whispered and adults checked weapons with grim determination. Abigail joined her at the window, her face pale but composed. "Thomas sent runners to Fort Davidson," she said softly, "but even if they get through, the soldiers won't arrive in time." "How bad could it be?" Eleanor asked, needing reassurance, but sensing none would be forthcoming. "Black Hawk's reputation is fearsome," Abigail admitted. "Last summer, he raided a settlement near the Red River, killed all the men, took 4 women captive. Only one was ever recovered, and she trailed off, unwilling to detail the woman's condition. Eleanor swallowed hard. "I see, but we're better prepared, more numerous," Abigail added quickly. "And we have Thomas and John Two Bears. They understand Comanche tactics." Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp cry came from the lookout posted in the church tower. "Riders!" "From the east!" Thomas climbed swiftly to the tower, then returned moments later, his expression tense but controlled. "It's them, about 30 warriors, Black Hawk at the lead." He addressed the assembled defenders. "Remember the plan. No one fires unless I give the signal. We show strength, but avoid provocation if possible." "And if they attack anyway?" asked the blacksmith, cradling a shotgun that looked tiny in his massive hands. "Then we defend what's ours," Thomas said simply. He turned to Eleanor and Abigail. "Stay with the children in the back room. No matter what you hear, keep them quiet." Eleanor wanted to object, to insist on knowing what was happening, but she recognized the wisdom in his instructions. The children would need calm guidance if the situation deteriorated. As she followed Abigail toward the small room behind the altar, she cast one last glance at Thomas. He stood straight and tall, rifle held casually but ready, his face set in lines of determination. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded church, and something unspoken passed between them. Not quite a farewell, but an acknowledgement of the danger they faced. Then Eleanor was in the back room, closing the heavy wooden door behind her, shutting out the sight of the man who had somehow become essential to her sense of security in this wild land. The waiting was excruciating. Through the thick walls, they could hear little beyond muffled voices and the occasional stamp of hooves outside. The children huddled together on blankets spread across the floor, some of the younger ones dozing despite the tension, others wide-eyed and alert to the adults' concern. "What's happening?" Eleanor whispered to Abigail, after what seemed an eternity but was likely less than half an hour. "Negotiation, probably," Abigail whispered back. "Thomas will try to reason with Black Hawk first. offer supplies, horses perhaps, in exchange for leaving peacefully. Will that work? Abigail's expression was grave. Sometimes. Black Hawk respects strength and fair dealing even from enemies, but his hatred of those who accept white ways runs deep. A sudden commotion outside made them both stiffen. Raised voices, the distinctive sound of rifles being cocked. Eleanor's hand found Abigail's, squeezing tightly as they strained to interpret the noises filtering through the walls. Then came the sound they most dreaded. A single gunshot, followed by the unmistakable war cry of Comanche warriors. The raid had begun. What followed was a nightmare of sound and fury, largely invisible to those in the back room, but terrifying nonetheless. Gunfire erupted, sporadic at first, then in concentrated volleys. Men shouted orders and warnings. Something, or someone, struck the church wall with enough force to dislodge dust from the ceiling. The children, startled from their uneasy calm, began to cry. Eleanor and Abigail moved among them, offering comfort, distractions, reassurance they themselves didn't feel. Eleanor found herself holding a sobbing Apache girl, no more than 4 years old, murmuring soothing nonsense as the battle raged beyond their sanctuary. "Will they get in?" one of the older boys asked, his face pale but his eyes determined, as if already calculating how he might defend the younger children. "The walls are strong," Abigail assured him, "and our men are brave and well prepared." Eleanor admired her friend's steadiness, the way she maintained hope without making false promises. It was the same quality that made her an excellent teacher, honest yet encouraging, realistic yet optimistic. The gunfire intensified, then gradually tapered off. Through a tiny window set high in the back wall, Eleanor could see smoke rising. Something in the settlement had been set aflame. Her thoughts flew to Sarah and Robert's cabin, to the schoolhouse, to the other homes and businesses that comprised their fragile community. How much would remain when this was over? And Thomas, was he still defending the main door? Had he been injured or worse in the fighting? The uncertainty was almost as agonizing as the danger itself. Just as the gunfire seemed to be subsiding, a new sound cut through the chaos, a bugle call, faint but distinctive, the cavalry signal for charge. The army. Abigail breathed, hoping to light her features. They've come. The battle's tenor changed abruptly. The war cries became more sporadic, the gunfire more disorganized. Through the window, Eleanor could see riders moving rapidly away from the settlement, pursued by the distant blue-uniformed figures of cavalry troopers. After what seemed an eternity, a knock came at the door. "It's over," called Robert's voice. "You can come out now." Eleanor helped gather the children, wiping tears and straightening clothing before leading them back into the main church. The scene that greeted them was one of controlled chaos, wounded men being tended on blankets near the altar, smoke drifting through the open door, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. Her eyes scanned the room frantically, searching for Thomas. She found him near the door, binding a wound on John Two Bear's arm with practiced efficiency. Relief flooded through her, so intense she had to steady herself against a pew. "Anyone hurt back there?" Robert asked, his physician's gaze assessing the emerging children and women. "No," Abigail reported, "though they're frightened. What happened?" "Black Hawk demanded we surrender all our horses, supplies, and single women of childbearing age," Robert explained grimly. When Thomas refused, one of the warriors shot at him. Missed, thankfully, but that started the fight. "And the army?" Eleanor asked, still watching Thomas from across the room. "How did they arrive so quickly?" Patrol was already nearby, investigating reports of the war party crossing treaty lands, Robert said. Thomas's runner found them less than an hour from here. As the immediate crisis subsided, the full extent of the damage became apparent. Two of Willow Creek's defenders had been seriously wounded, though Robert believed both would recover. 3 buildings had been set ablaze, including, to Eleanor's dismay, the schoolhouse. "Everything's gone," Abigail said dully, as they stood surveying the smouldering ruins. "The books, the slates, all our teaching materials." Eleanor put her arm around her friend's shoulders. "We'll rebuild, better than before." "With what?" Abigail asked, uncharacteristic defeat in her voice. "We had so little to begin with, and now—" "With determination," came Thomas's voice behind them, "and with help." They turned to find him standing with Captain Jeffords, both men dust-covered and grim but unbowed. "The army will provide materials for rebuilding," Jeffords announced. "Consider it reparation for the treaty violation. Black Hawk may have escaped today, but he won't find sanctuary anywhere in the territory now." Eleanor studied Thomas's face, noting the fatigue etched there, the small cut above his left eyebrow, the resolute set of his jaw. He had stood between his adopted community and his birth people, choosing a future of cooperation over the past's. Vengeance. The cost of that choice was written in every line of his face. "Thank you," she said simply, meeting his eyes. He nodded once, understanding all she couldn't express in that moment. "We endure," he replied, "all of us, together." As the sun set over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across damaged buildings and weary defenders, Eleanor realized that the settlement had changed her irrevocably. 3 weeks ago she had been a proper Boston spinster, seeking security through marriage. Now she stood amid the aftermath of a Comanche raid, her future uncertain, but unquestionably her own. And somehow, despite everything, or perhaps because of it, she wouldn't have traded her place for all the comfort and safety Boston could offer. 3 months after the Comanche raid, autumn painted Willow Creek in gold and amber. The schoolhouse stood rebuilt, larger than before, thanks to Captain Jeffords' promised assistance. Eleanor had settled into her role as teacher, now living in a small cabin adjacent to the school. Evening found her preparing for the harvest celebration, carefully placing Thomas's gift, a silver comb with a turquoise stone, in her hair. The woman in her small mirror barely resembled the proper Bostonian who had arrived at Wishbone Station, her confidence and purpose evident in her sun-kissed face. Sarah arrived to escort her to the festivities. "The comb suits you. My brother has surprisingly good taste for a man who owns 2 shirts. "Thomas asked your opinion?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "He's beginning to see there might be room in his life for more than duty," Sarah replied with a knowing smile. The settlement center glowed with lantern light. Tables laden with harvest bounty stood surrounded by community members from all backgrounds. Even Thomas had made an appearance, wearing his usual buckskin pants but paired with a proper white shirt, his hair neatly trimmed. Throughout the meal, Eleanor felt his presence like a compass needle sensing north. Captain Jeffords engaged them both in conversation about the proposed new treaty, one that might actually be honored. "The General proposes fixed boundaries but with seasonal hunting. Permissions," Thomas explained. "It's more flexible than previous arrangements." "Will it satisfy both sides?" Eleanor asked. "No treaty ever does, completely," Thomas replied meaningfully. "But sometimes creating space for understanding is enough to begin with." As music filled the night and couples began to dance, Thomas leaned closer. "Would you like to walk? The creek is peaceful at night." They slipped away unnoticed, following the familiar path to the fallen log where they had sat months earlier. Stars blanketed the sky, and moonlight silvered the water's surface. "Do you miss Boston?" Thomas asked quietly. "I miss libraries and concerts," Eleanor admitted. "But I don't miss being defined by what I lacked rather than what I contribute." "And here? What defines you?" "My choices," she said simply. "Each day I choose to teach, to learn, to adapt." Thomas turned toward her. "When I found you at Wishbone Station, I thought you were like other Eastern women, fragile, unsuited to frontier life. Now I see your strength has nothing to do with physical power. Your courage doesn't require a weapon. His words warmed her more than any fire could. You've changed too. You allow yourself moments of peace between vigilant watches. Eleanor, he said, voice low and serious, I have no right to ask anything of you. My life is complicated. My future, uncertain. After everything, do you still see me as someone seeking the easiest path? She challenged. No, he acknowledged. But you should understand what choosing to walk alongside someone like me would mean. Challenges, prejudice from both worlds, children who might never fully belong in either. He continued, voice softening, but also a life built on mutual respect, partnership in its truest sense, and deep affection that could grow into something more enduring than any treaty. Eleanor's heart quickened. This measured declaration represented a profound opening of his guarded heart. I've never sought the easiest path, she said, taking his hand, only the one that leads toward becoming the person I want to be, alongside those who see me clearly. His fingers closed around hers. And who do you want to be? Someone who builds rather than merely exists, who teaches children to see beyond boundaries. She moved closer, emboldened by the moment's significance. Someone who recognizes the value of a rare soul, regardless of complexities. Thomas touched the silver comb in her hair, then gently traced her cheek. I have nothing to offer but myself, just a promise to walk beside you for as long as our paths align. That, Eleanor whispered, is worth more than all the cattle ranches. In Texas, when they returned to the celebration hand in hand, few expressed surprise. Sarah exchanged knowing glances with Robert. Abigail smiled approvingly. Grandmother Blue Feather nodded with ancient wisdom, murmuring, "The hawk has landed. The winter will be warmer for it." In the years that followed, Willow Creek endured through challenges, harsh winters, political changes, even Wells's eventual return, though diminished and bitter. The settlement flourished, strengthened by its diversity. The school produced students who carried its values into a changing frontier. Thomas continued bridging worlds, his position eventually valued by both army and tribal leaders. And in their small cabin near the schoolhouse, Eleanor practiced daily the lesson learned that fateful summer, that life's most meaningful journeys often begin with apparent misfortune, and sometimes being left behind is the first step toward finding where you truly belong. When asked how they met, she would begin the story with a simple truth that contained worlds of meaning. I was left at a deserted station until a lone Comanche scout found me. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.